that kind of gets into the finer details of tracking. So in the case of 3 examples of
Mhm.
in grass, in mud, and in snow, I kind of want to touch on what a fresh and what an old track is like. And maybe we'll take a break in between these to touch on the finer
Mhm.
details of what you're explaining here. But starting off with like mud, you're what I would say is an ideal scenario because it lasts longer than snow sometimes. I really love like a fresh mud
Mhm.
track. Um, what are the characteristics? Say you have a completely untouched with leaves, anything like that, like you're just of pure imprint. Like, what are the things you're looking for in the soil as far as aging the track, and what are the characteristics of an old and a fresh track?
I guess a fresh track would be how sharp the edges are in the mud. So like an older track is going to get rounded off from gravity pushing it down, where a fresh track is going to be very sharp, crisp. It looks uh, the word sharp is kind of the how I would like to tell it. It's very defining edges.
Mm,
The mud is, you know, let's say it's in a creek bottom, but steps in it and it doesn't fill up with any water yet.
mm,
After maybe a couple hours, it's going to get that slight film on the bottom that has a little bit of moisture where the water rises back to the surface, creating
mm,
that mud. So it's going to, over time, then it's going to slowly fill in and settle. So as it gets older and older, it's going to get more flattened out, where a real fresh one's going to look perfectly like imprinted.
yeah. I've always wondered, like, I've always thought of doing this, and I think it's a little extra, but like I've always been really manual with teaching myself these things. Like I've taken a tape measure out, for instance. I've been that anal about it and literally quantified like the distance of the width and height of a big track. But I've always wondered about like taking a hoof. Like I have so many hooves of like deer I've shot in the past to make like coat hangers and shit like that. But
Mhm.
um, I've always thought about taking the hoof of a mature buck and just imprinting it next to that track and seeing what a 2 second old track looks like in comparison. I think that's like super. I feel like I've conceptualized it enough to understand it at this point, but I feel like that's something that could help a new person out. Do you ever see like cracking in the soil, like in a drier mud climate where maybe it's not filling with water, it's just got time to dry since then? Do you?
Yeah, yeah, you definitely can see where it's dried out. Maybe some type of like seed is blown into it.
No, yeah, yeah.
Any type of disturbance afterwards. If it's really calm out and you see something that went into it, like a blade of grass or something like that, it might tell you that it was yesterday and you're not within that 12-hour, 10-hour period or whatever. But going back to the track thing of fresh, like, why don't you step beside it? I'm 195 pounds.
Hmm.
I want to see what, if I take my boot and I put all my weight on my toe, how far do I sink in versus that track?
I like
It,
that you pointed out your toe too to like talk about the surface area of it too.
yeah, you don't want to do your whole boot because your surface area is covered. I mean, your foot's way bigger than a deer track. You just kind of want to do just the tip of your foot, and you're going to sink in, and it's just going to tell you
Hmm.
small intangibles. Like you're trying to best guess what is going on and what that deer is, right? Like mature deer, I sunk in the same. It's very sharp. This is the sense of direction. It went up the other creek bank. When it hit the top, it slipped. I seen its dew claw. And then the next one, you could tell there was a narrow set of trees. It went around the trees because it couldn't fit its rack through. It's probably a big deer.
I love
Like,
that. I love how analytical you are and how many different like reference points you use, really. Like that's like my favorite thing with learning this stuff is giving people actual quantifiable ways to like
mhm,
test their knowledge and like I love that you're testing actively as you go. Like that, I think that makes a huge difference.
mhm,
I will point out that a deer typically has 2 hooves on the ground at the whole time, at all the time too. So like,
mhm.
your boot isn't always going to be as perfect as the width of a deer track. So I feel like it makes a lot of sense the way you're testing it. It's more accurate to what two hooves in contact with the ground looks like. We all see that running track that, you know, everyone posts like found my first 4-finger track or whatever. And it's like
Yeah.
the one time that I have 1 foot down and it's like way splayed out.
Split
Do
out.
you put a
Yep.
lot of stock in those tracks that are splayed more wide at the tip than they are at the base?
Not typically, because they are completely stretched out. I mean, to their max, and they're running. Typically, I don't really like to care about running tracks, because
Same.
that tells me one of two things happen. They're either chasing something or they're being chased.
Yeah. And if that's the first track you come across, it could be a doe that like
Yeah,
slid a 1/4 inch and made it look pretty. And
yeah, I mean, yeah, I've been in the Midwest a few times, and right at the edge of a cornfield, you see these giant tracks, and you're just like, what giant buck made that? But realistically, like any 2-year-old just running in that soft agriculture mud made it.
Yep.
You know,
that's
it's
such a
not
good
very,
example too. The edge of a cornfield. That every time I see pictures posted of displayed tracks, it's the edge of a cornfield.
yeah, you see the big dew claws in the back too.
Yeah.
You see basically all four. And you see how long a stride it is, and you see the mud kicked up, and you can basically see it for 100 yards.
Yeah, you're like, this deer is 9 feet long. Like,
Yeah.
that's great. Well, man. So next, I would say the next example that has a lot of details would be snow. So in snow, what are you looking for? And I have a side question about snow to follow up after this.
Yeah, snow is where it gets really cool. So
Literally.
you get so a fresh track, I go down and feel the texture of the snow. Did it freeze at all afterwards? Did it melt at all? Did the sun hit it? Did the sun not hit it? How far the snow's kicked? Is it dragging its feet? How deep is the snow? There's so many different details in snow that you learn. But the number one would basically be, when the snow was kicked up, is there a layer of, did it get glazed? So take a mug out of the freezer and set it down on your table. How long until it starts frosting over? Then wipe it with your finger, and how long until it frosts back over? And it's the same as like, okay, when a deer stepped in snow and then kicked it up, okay, if it was the evening, it's on this, what side of the slope is it on? It's in the shade, it glazed over. It's going to tell you that it's a couple hours old, because it stayed in that cold, weather, where a lot of people don't realize when it snows, the bottom layer is softer than the top layer, because of, its moisture content and constantly getting compressed down, where you've kicked over snow tops. The top is that 1/4 inch of ice, below it's nice, soft, fluffy snow. So you can learn, it was crunchy out, it kicked it, now it's soft. There's so many variables that can go into snow.
Yeah. And then I'm sure the same things apply with crisp edges, of course. Like, everyone knows what melting snow is like and all that stuff too. To your point about compressing the snow essentially into ice, something I found a lot in the marshes in the off season is, I'm not like scouting necessarily fresh tracks in the off season to find it, but you can tell a mature buck walked here and you can get a feel for how he uses the terrain. But I've found that mature buck beds in the thaw tend to last more, because they compress that snow and they create basically a sheet of ice. And it's like, now instead of the negative where the track is the imprint, it's the positive. So like the track is sticking out amongst thawed terrain. So are you finding that, like, maybe in your off-season tracking where you're just trying to get a feel for like their routes, are you finding like yourself tracking the positive tracks, the little pieces of ice left over from what was a large imprint to maybe a larger bed? Do you ever use that to actually quantify the size of the deer that was using the area?
I've never done it that way. I know
It's hard
exactly
because you
what
have
you
to
mean,
time
though.
the melt like perfect.
You
like,
have to, you have to time it right. But that is a very big possibility that you could use. I personally have never used it. I use the opposite of that. The negative impact.
Because you're
You can
shooting the deer
tell,
at the time.
yeah. But you can tell, you know, the size of bed, you know, I've came across where there's been a bed and you can see like tine marks where he like kind of like went to lick himself, and you've seen a tine mark like right in the middle of his back where the tip, you know, his beam came around, and when he was licking himself, his beam touched the snow because the snow is 3-4 inches tall.
That is so cool.
Man.
And you just learn like, okay, now this is a good deer. And that's when I start getting really excited, is when you start seeing stuff like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. And the last one, sorry guys, I'm totally hogging the questions. But with grass, so like you're not seeing typically imprints, right? And we talked a little bit about similar breaks in grass and stuff like that. But when it's hard for you, let's maybe make this less distinct. When it's hard for you to pick out individual tracks, how are you keeping on that trail? And then how are you determining how fresh that trail is when you might not be able to pick out individual tracks?
For me, I just slow down and get a little more methodical.
Yeah.
It's harder to do, so I'll get down to basically not really on my hands and knees, but I'll be kneeling and I'll physically use my fingers and feel for like indentations in grasses. Like let's say marsh grass, right? Like you can feel the indentation where there was a disturbance. You can feel the next one where there was a disturbance, where in between is going to be pretty much plush and nice and loose. Think about a cotton swab, where when you first pull it apart, it's nice and fluffy, but if you touch it once, it has an indentation, but it doesn't really look like it is. It's got compressed a little bit. So grass is very similar.
I've noticed that with canary grass a lot, like the commonly marsh grass, right? Like it only stays flat for so long, right? It only stays compressed for so long, and then it kind of revives. A really cool phenomenon I've seen in the cattails is with these freezes we have, they thaw out, and there's like an hour-long period where they're wet. Well, like the cattails, like it's really hard to pick out a deer walking through in the time that they start thawing when the sun hits them, because they'll go stiff and then all of a sudden they'll just and they'll sway, you know, when they finally reach that peak of thawing out. So for a while, like all the cattails are like doing these quick sporadic movements like a deer would when they're walking through it. So you pointed out wanting to track in the morning. I'm sure you look at if the dew's been wiped off and stuff like that along the trail. But that recovery of exactly what you're saying, that recovery of the media that they're walking through is a really interesting way to gauge time on them, especially if you're lucky enough to have dew or frost.
It's time of year, so every scenario is going to be different. Just try to be more methodical about it. So, okay, what time is the sun hitting this angle? What's the temperature like? The moisture content? It's just basically being analytical about it. Like you said, the track in grass, what is its retention rate? So like it's going to come back over time, but it's imprinted pretty hard, but it's covered in moisture. That tells you it was right before the dew settled, which that I can't remember the correct term, but like right as the sun comes up, it gets cold, you know, the cold air sinks.
Yep.
Which and everything gets covered in moisture. So okay, you're there at 7:30. That would tell you, let's say it got dark, you know, got light at 6. It probably was sometime in that 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock range. So you're 2-3 hours behind it. It's not super fresh, but it's, you know, if that's something that it's going back into an area that you were already headed. So it's just being analytical about it and trying to break down all the details as much as possible. It's just giving you a better starting point.
Yeah. Another thing I noticed is some grasses don't really part. Like some grasses stay vertical throughout the year. So you can tell with the way that, like before they return vertical, with the direction that they were broken, sometimes you run across multiple deer and you have to decide which one's the one that is yours that you continued on, and using that direction that it's parted. And then sometimes grass does typically part with like the common wind. I've noticed like on the tail end of little islands in the cattails, the cattails like are all folded over because the grass isn't like laying them a certain way, so they suck to get through on those islands because it's all at like chest height. Well, when you're off of that and they have a natural part that does with the wind direction, when a buck has a nice cage and sometimes they go against that part for a while, you'll see that trail, the top of that trail is actually parted over the opposite direction of everything else. And sometimes you can't pick out a track because it's in standing water, and you can kind of use splatter on the cattails and how high that's going habitually to see the size maybe, but you have almost nothing to go off of to know if it's big or not, other than how is that grass parted over.
Yeah. Another thing, like you were saying though, like what came to my mind was real tall grass, and it's all wet moisture, and his rack is actually hitting the tops of all the grass. You can maybe see it's all beaded off. It's wicked off higher that height, which tells you, I mean, he was, because they're not going to let their ears get wet, but their rack will get wet. So it's just hitting that top of that grass the entire way, which is going to give you a deciding factor. And then you stand there and you're like, okay, I mean, he's probably 18, 20 inches wide. I mean, who knows what it is, but good enough for me.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a lot of factors working in your favor in the morning for tracking. Like that's got to be like a sweet time to do it, because you have a lot more you can consider with dew, frost, the sun, temperature. You know, things staying colder typically. The tracks wear differently. You know, I think that's really interesting.
It's what gives you the amount of time that you need too.
Yeah, the daylight. I mean, most people that are tracking are trying to hunt, so it's like you're trying to get there in a time frame that you can hunt. I know some old time trackers. If you read some of the old time books, they start their tracks 3-4 a.m.
Wow.
So on high daylight, they start tracking them in the nighttime, and because think about it, deer slow down in the daylight.
Yeah.
They'll beeline throughout the night, but as soon as it starts cracking daylight, they might start slowing down, getting more methodical, thinking about where they're going back to bed, being where they want to be, slowing down. So, and two, I mean, you can walk up on deer and they're not as jumpy in the dark where they are in daylight. So some of the old time guys in the Northeast, they start tracking bright and early, you know, before it even cracks daylight, and they're within killing distance is it's getting daylight.